The Running Man was not good. It's not without its merits, but ultimately I was left underwhelmed.
I'm gonna come back here and burn this building down. I promise. That's the spirit.
Your Bloomingdale's gift card.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. For the last year or so, I've been doing source material videos on my channel where I will read the source material of a new film adaptation. I make a video about that source material, and then I review the film once it's released. I did that for The Running Man, which was written by Stephen King under the Richard Bachman pseudonym, which is an alias he has used to approach his writing a bit differently. I don't have the full explanation memorized, but I did read an explanation that he shared of it in the copy of The Long Walk, which I had borrowed from the library to read. I shared some thoughts about that over on my Patreon. The Running Man was also a library book I had borrowed, which is why I don't currently have a copy of it to hold up and show you as a relevant prop to today's film review. If you haven't read the book, I would say that there is more room for you to watch this new film and enjoy it as a simplistic, violent, man-on-the-run sort of action film. If you want to see something that is superficially entertaining on the big screen, and that sort of action from a man on the run is something that you have a particular affinity for, then I would recommend it to you, even though I don't rate this film particularly well. I think that opening weekend reviews or early reviews are an important way of informing viewers of whether or not the film is something that they would like, because nowadays cinema tickets aren't always affordable, so you'll often want to really be selective and hone in on the films that are best suited to the type of thing that you want to spend your time and money seeing on the big screen. But as for my stance on this latest adaptation, my opening remarks are as follows. Vapid and vacuous, The Running Man 2025 is as noisy and violent a spectacle as the exploitative show in the story. A cowardly refusal to include any of the book's most interesting ideas ensures this adaptation is devoid of any nutritional value. Harsh, I know. Considerably more harsh than I had expected I would be when I first finished watching the film, but the longer I sat with the execution of this adaptation and going over the various choices that were made about which parts of the book were kept and which parts were removed, the more frustrated I became. Now, this version is not without its entertaining qualities. Lee Pace is far too good for how little he's given to do, although I will clarify that his role of McCone is far more than his book counterpart has. The book counterpart only shows up at the very end to be what amounts to a Fed in a suit. Colman Domingo is a total scene stealer every time he performs for the audience, both within the story and those of us who are watching. And a special honorable mention for whomever made the fake teeth that Josh Brolin's character Killian is wearing in this. They are horrific to look at and completely suit the character. Now, for those who haven't read the book but are familiar with Edgar Wright's work to enough of an extent that you have a very clear image in your mind of what you regard as his distinct visual style, that being one of hyper-stylized cinematography and editing, often indulging in musicality, of synchronizing with the soundtrack, I will tell you right now that this film doesn't indulge in that hyper-stylization to the same degree as some of his other films. I've skimmed a bit of online feedback about this film, and it seems as though some viewers were unhappy about that choice. But from the perspective of having read the book, there is a darkness and a somber sadness to this story that makes it to where I think it makes perfect sense for Edgar Wright to pull back on that and choose his moments carefully of when he's going to crescendo into the full bombastic delivery that certain viewers know him for. And I'm also saying this from the perspective of being a viewer who tends to prefer maximalism as a visual style and aesthetic. Baz Luhrmann is one of my favorites, and his style is very much more is more. I am going to be talking about spoilers now, so hopefully I've shared enough for you to gauge whether or not this film is something you would like to see at the cinema. If you want my recommendation for seeing an action blockbuster that I preferred the overall execution of, I would recommend Predator Badlands instead. I have my monthly movie pass, so I watch lots of films, but if you are going to the cinema on a per ticket basis, so you're not going to see everything on the big screen, you're being more selective, that's my pick. I'm not going to go on a whole side tangent explaining my thoughts on that film, but there you have it. Now, onto the spoilers for The Running Man. On a more superficial level, this first thing I'm going to mention is small in the grand scheme of things, but I would like to lay a foundation for some of the larger points I want to address. Glen Powell is not as believable as a blue-collar worker as I would have liked for him to be in a story that's addressing what this story is addressing. Yuppie scum getting smacked by Bane, douchey frat bro delivering snarky comebacks, finance bro with a false bravado, all of these things are believable for Glen Powell to play. But the fact that when Ben Richards is leaving his humble abode to go to the station in search of work that can pay for his sick daughter's medicine, there was this nagging sensation in the back of my mind about how I didn't believe this was a man from the streets. Looking back on that with the gift of hindsight, it was foreshadowing larger issues I was going to have with the film's narrative. Now, for those of you who haven't read the book or you haven't seen my source material video going over a lot of details of what's in the source materials pages, there are certain aspects of the book that I didn't particularly enjoy, but I more or less assumed they would simply remove during the adaptation process. For example, Ben Richards in the book says racial slurs. Movie Ben Richards doesn't say any of those. Ben Richards in the book, when he takes Emilia hostage and she's lashing out because of her fear over these circumstances, but also because of the propaganda that the network has espoused against Ben specifically, as well as the broader working class, Ben Richards in the book fantasizes about forcing her out of her car and assaulting her. That's a very easy thing to not put in the film, and it's not in the film. A character thinking something horrific in their mind is not going to be known to a film audience unless the people making that film go out of their way to make those thoughts known to the audience. Movie Ben Richards doesn't think that way. The changes are ones I like, and I had assumed they would modify the source material in those ways. However, one alteration I didn't know they would make is saying that movie Ben Richards has tried and failed to form unions. I don't recall book Ben Richards being a union man. I do remember a great deal of information being communicated about his negative experiences with doing jobs with poor working conditions and him having developed an increasing amount of hostility towards authority. Being hostile towards authority is not interchangeable with doing the enormous amount of work of trying to organize workers to form a union. And for a film that repeatedly shied away from taking strong political stances, it's a peculiar choice to make your leading man an attempted union leader. So we have my skepticism about finding Glen Powell believable as a blue-collar worker, and then you are invoking labor unions without the ideology to back it up. This is when I introduce one of the most significant alterations to the material that I disliked, and it's one of two main issues I'm going to address because I'm simply not interested in belaboring my critical rating of this adaptation. In the book and movie, Ben Richards, at one point while on the run, is saved by Bradley and his family, and he stays with them for a bit before he moves on to the next part of his ongoing run with their help to escape this area where they live. In the book, though, the explanation Bradley gives Ben about how deep the corruption goes with the network and how deeply intertwined the network is with manufacturing and maintaining the oppressive systemic inequality of the world that these people live in is much more detailed. In the movie, there's just a passing mention about environmental poisoning and the Running Man show, along with all of the other shows, being a means of pacifying the masses and maintaining the status quo. In the book, the explanation is significantly more detailed. The environmental poisoning is so bad that one of the reasons the shows the network puts on are important is that these shows will keep people inside for longer so they're not poisoned as quickly. So then those people can stay just healthy enough to keep working, but also dumbed down enough to where they're not going to rise up against their oppressors, tear everything down, and rebuild a better way of living that's good for everyone. Rich people have access to special nose filters that help to manage exposure to poisonous air. The reason why Bradley's little sister has cancer at such a young age is because filters are largely inaccessible to poorer neighborhoods. And with Bradley living in a poor, predominantly black neighborhood, the living conditions are even worse than Ben's poor neighborhood, where the residents are not predominantly black. But Bradley has been able to learn a lot of this information because he and some friends stole a library card. And it was there that he was able to read numerous books that unlocked all of these larger secrets about the issues of pollution, systemic inequality, and he was even able to teach himself how to make nose filters using cheap, affordable materials to try to help keep him and his family healthier. If you've only seen the movie but not read the book, you will remember that Bradley gave Ben instructions about meeting up with Elton, who is Michael Cera's character. In the book, Bradley and Elton know each other because they're essentially part of a revolutionary book club, an anti-pollution club of sorts. This part of the story is incredibly meaningful and impactful to Ben. So much so that he makes repeated efforts to spread the truths he has learned from them in the tapes he sends into the network. In the film, they condense this down to maybe one attempt to get some of that truth out. And when Ben goes on the run in between his time with Bradley and Elton, when he's disguised as a blind priest, you will have seen him dressed like that in the film, and it's played largely to comedic effect. Ben, in the book, spends his days going to the library to read about pollution and his nights watching The Running Man to see if they're onto him. Movie Ben Richards? I don't think that man has read a single book in his entire adult life. The film strips the vast majority of this important world-building information, this central pillar of the story's villain, of what the protagonist is up against, in favor of an unfunny cutaway gag of some fake reality show that appears to be a thinly veiled parody of the Kardashians. I would have rather you cut that parody out and further fleshed out the full scale of the network's crimes, the large-scale environmental poisoning, and yes, include Ben Richards' trips to the library. Why shouldn't he hide in the library? Libraries are hardly crowded places. If you go to a library, you're not going to find people snooping on each other. It's people preoccupied with whatever they're reading, or if they're on a library computer, they're focused on whatever they're looking at online. And I know this because I regularly go to the library to check out books to either do source material videos on, or books I simply want to read for the sake of reading. World-building details, thematic enrichment, all of those things put momentarily aside. A library is actually a brilliant place to go lay low when you're a man on the run. Now, this new version of The Running Man really leans into the mass surveillance state that will resonate with the audience that's watching the film. Throw your Ring cameras away because the cops can look through those without getting your permission first. So in this version of The Running Man, he would, in all likelihood, need to go on the run a lot sooner rather than later. Nonetheless, the lack of library time, the lack of reading, the lack of world building, it makes the overall story feel hollow and flimsy in comparison to its source material. And this brings us to the film's ending. First, a bit of context for anyone who didn't read the book or watch my source material video about the book. Originally, Ben Richards is mortally wounded in all of the action that happens on the plane, and by the time all of those henchmen are dead, Ben Richards has an abdominal wound that's severe enough that a significant amount of his intestines are dragging out of his body. I already know A Running Man by Sam Raimi would have kept that from the book, and it would have been darkly twisted and probably a bit hilarious. It's fine, though. He's finally out of director's jail. I will be pre-ordering my ticket for Send Help most expeditiously. But anyway, continuing with the Running Man source material. In those pages, Ben Richards' family was murdered by random robbers who broke into their home. It's mostly presented as having nothing to do with the show. It doesn't really entertain the notion of even being suspicious. It's just an extremely tragic turn of events. When they said in the film that Ben's family would be taken into protective custody, I immediately knew, oh, okay, so they're going to be doing that differently than how it was in the book. Good for me, because watching Perline die once was already painful enough, and I would rather not have to do it again this soon. I know her name is Jayme Lawson, but I'm saying Perline just as an excuse to bring up Ryan Coogler's Sinners, because that was a much better film than this.
It's my favorite movie of all time.
Yeah, me too.
Back to the source material. Ben is mortally wounded, his family is dead, so at this point he has nothing to live for. So he follows through on the book's early foreshadowing about him coming back to the building and bringing it down by flying the plane into the television station and making direct eye contact with Killian before crash landing into his office. I already assumed they were not going to keep the book's ending because I didn't believe that Hollywood would keep their action hero on the trajectory of flying a plane into a building as one final hurrah to make a statement against the architects and enforcers of the world's misery. And I was right. But the film's ending is so haphazardly thrown together, nothing is explained. It's nothing more than checking off a list of things they wanted the ending to do without ever making it flow in a coherent way from everything else you've seen beforehand. Every decision Ben Richards takes in the film up until that point are understandable. They're mostly ones that follow the book. Every action, every decision, and every attack he fends off, all of these things lead him to the next place you see him run away to. But the ending feels like something thrown together last minute to satisfy corporate demands. Don't have your main action girly fly into a building, have him survive, have his family survive, have him sort of reunite with them, but without the emotional payoff, and have him kill Josh Brolin's Killian because that's the main villain of the story. You speed run through all of those things without explaining how he would even get access to funds that surely the network would have refused to hand over directly to him since he defied them and maybe he was playing dead. So how did he pay for his wife and daughter's groceries? And then this studio audience manages to get inside the building for a taping with all of these weapons as if there wouldn't be numerous security measures in place. And you didn't even have Ben and Dan Killian do some sort of final standoff, let them monologue at one another because you're assuming it was just good enough to use what happened on the plane. Well, it's not. It feels rushed. It feels like you're speed running to check off a list of what your bosses insisted on you doing. I would have rather Ben died, to be honest. It would have had more dramatic impact if he had sacrificed himself and became a martyr. So ultimately, all we're left with is a corporate product full of corporate product placements and a story that refuses to follow through on any of the book's most interesting ideas. All of the intrigue is gone. It's as vapid and violent of a noisy spectacle as the Running Man show that we're supposed to be horrified by within the film itself. Edgar Wright, we know he's capable of more, which is why I will probably still see whatever he does next. Lee Pace, Colman Domingo, 10s across the board. I have no notes for either one of them. And Glen Powell, I implore you, please do another silly, whimsical rom-com. Too many actors are not willing to be silly and ridiculous, but he is. And it really suits a rom-com that pays homage to 2000s era rom-coms. So do another one.
Smells like coffee here. It's like meth. I'm guessing. No, I'm not. I worked at Goldman. Partner's wedding. You do what you do.